Mozambique Channel, the $20 trillion wall no navy can stop. The boats wouldn't go back in, not at night. Alarms screamed at the Afungi airstrip while contractors crowded onto a plane that felt too small for the fear in their eyes. Patrols hovered outside the surf line, then turned away. On shore, families hid in mangroves, waiting for calls that didn't come. $20 trillion sat inside a financial kill zone, and approach corridor insurers had quietly redlined. Ships hesitated, premiums exploded, and nobody could point to a single ship flying a skull and crossbones. Here's where it gets interesting. This isn't piracy. It's a moving wall no one can see. To track it, follow the money and the currents. The invisible wall, money, risk, and a narrow sea. To understand how a sea closes without a single boom laid, start with geography that behaves like finance. The Mozambique Channel narrows traffic between reefs, shoals, and a coastline that offers cover at every bend. Southbound, the Agulhas Current runs like a conveyor belt, fast and unforgiving. Mariners talk about rogue wave risk here with the same tone accountants use for tail risk, rare, devastating, and priced into every serious decision. Now layer insurance maps over that water. The neat grid lines of underwriters translate wind, swell, and insurgent footprints into color codes. When Lloyd's Joint War Committee updates its lists, a green lane can shade to amber or red with a single incident. That color shift isn't cosmetic. It hardwires into spreadsheets from London to Singapore, and overnight a cargo that cleared the margin yesterday becomes uneconomic today. Revelation 1, a memo can act like a blockade. No mines, no warships, just a war risk list that moves a decimal and turns a functioning corridor into a financial kill zone. LNG shipping lives on thin edges. Break-evens are a math problem that looks simple until the ocean intervenes. Day rates spike when global demand tightens. Whether windows shrink approach times, tugs cost more if you miss the tide. And if a skiff appears from the lee of a reef and forces a diversion, the lost hours don't just bruise pride, they can wipe out a quarter's margin on the voyage. One ambush, even a failed one, triggers premiums, rerouting, and a paper trail of penalties in charter parties, breach warranties, deviation clauses, off-hire disputes. Each clause clicks like a domino. Get this: on a Tuesday morning, a captain sees whitewater where there shouldn't be any. The swell is up, the radar is dirty with shoreline clutter, and two slow-moving dhows drift across the planned track. Approach time to the anchorage is 2 hours if everything breaks your way, 4 if anything misbehaves. The captain looks at the sea state, checks the nightfall time, and calls it. He declines the approach. Across the world, a CFO stares at a loss they can defend to the board. Live to ship another day beats gambling a hull, a crew, and a brand on a twilight run into a blind zone. Revelation 2, one captain's no becomes a fleet-wide habit. A single refused approach ripples into premiums, policy, and portfolio rules that lock the lane until cost itself enforces the blockade. But the invisible wall isn't just waves and fear. It's the convergence of stakeholders whose incentives don't line up. The state wants revenue, stability, and control. LNG majors want predictable schedules and a corridor they can insure. Insurers want clarity on exposure and credible signals that risk is trending down, not up. Private maritime security companies want contracts that allow them to operate within the law's gray edges, not in defiance of them. Insurgents want leverage and headlines, and they've learned that strangling logistics beats stand-up fights. Fishermen want to go home with a catch and not be treated like decoys or targets. Each group acts rationally inside their constraints, and together they form a system that makes caution contagious. In a kill-zone economy, fear compounds like interest. Here's the quiet part nobody advertises: underwriting collapses faster than patrol boats can mobilize. Lloyd's Joint War Committee doesn't sail, it circulates memos. A listing expands to cover waters off Cabo Delgado after a cluster of incidents, and capital downstream flinches. Reinsurers, who take slices of risk from the primary insurers, look at their retrocession models and start whispering no. The cost of cover jumps. P&I clubs raise deductibles. Owners who used to call at Mocimboa de Praia Cross that port off their rotation. The corridor narrows again, not in miles, but in bankability. Meanwhile, the ocean keeps its own calendar. The Agulhas Current accelerates south of the channel, and cyclones season the air with systems that can shut down small craft operations for days. Escorts can't run in every sea state. Nighttime plus swell equals blind zones where a skiff can ride the edges of radar clutter, masked by Dow traffic that's been there for generations. You can put a helicopter in the air, but fuel range and crew hours still apply, and weather wins the argument more often than the brochure admits. Now add LNG's unforgiving timing. A 6-hour weather delay on approach means you miss the tide into a constrained berth. Miss the tide and you miss the slot. Miss the slot and you either sit on the hook burning cash or you deviate to a secondary port that wasn't in the contract. Every step in that chain has a number attached to it. The spreadsheet doesn't care if the reason was a rumor of gunfire inland, a fast line of squalls, or a sonar contact that turned out to be nothing. The cell flips from black to red, and someone higher up cancels the next voyage. What nobody knew, at least not publicly, was how quickly that caution could harden into policy. Captains talk, owners listen, and charterers feel the heat from buyers who can't absorb another blown delivery into a stressed grid. The Joint War Committee's listings become the industry's weather report, not binding law, but close enough to dictate behavior. Within weeks, the maybe we should wait becomes we don't call there anymore. While that was happening offshore, money was already rewriting onshore plans. Contracts that looked airtight on paper suddenly had force majeure clauses underlined. Security plans drafted in air-conditioned rooms met the physics of delay and the psychology of crews who have to live with their calls. The invisible wall wasn't a line you could patrol. It was the sum of fear, finance, and a narrow sea that doesn't forgive hesitation. But hold on, because what I'm about to tell you next lives onshore, not at sea. And it's the third revelation, the onshore cash scandal that primed the coast for recruitment long before the first skiff shadowed a convoy. Cabo Delgado, where the gas meets the gun. 3 days before that night on the water, men with rifles walked into Palma as if the map had turned to sand. Phones went dark. Roads that fed a fungi were cut with a mix of checkpoints and fear. Mocimboa de Praia, already battered from earlier seizures, sat as a warning. Here, the shore decides who moves and who doesn't. Inside the fenced grid of a fungi, the planned city for the liquefied natural gas build, schedules that used to be printed in color turned grayscale. The fence still stood. The plan did not. Revelation 3. The Insurgency's recruitment base was fertilized years earlier by a $2 billion hidden loan scandal that shattered trust, crashed livelihoods, and turned disappointed promises into a pipeline of fighters. The stakes were supposed to be simple, a roughly $60 billion build that would stitch Cabo Delgado into global energy maps and payrolls. Instead, hiring boards emptied into displacement lists. The promise of training certificates and per diems gave way to bus tickets south and mattresses on school floors. Contractors counted days between invoices and evacuations. The project's heartbeat, convoys, cranes, and concrete, slowed to a pulse you could miss if you blinked. Insurgents didn't need to hold ground forever. They learned that cutting roads and torching logistics had more leverage than flag raising. A burned truck on the wrong stretch of laterite could strand a week of supplies. A rumor at the wrong moment could empty a work camp. The men who planned safe rooms and rally points watched their pages curl in the humidity. Helicopters lifted out non-essential staff first, then staff who insisted they were essential until the rotor wash convinced them otherwise. Then came the paperwork that mattered more than the speeches, force majeure. Total Energies declared it in 2021, and the legal freeze rippled outward. Suppliers invoked their own clauses. Off-takers recalculated. The restart window, once pitched like a short pause, slid toward 2028, 2029, even 2030. Every new quarter put a question mark over contracts inked in quieter rooms. In Europe and Asia, traders adjusted delivery curves and told regulators they'd found other cover, even if cover meant paying more. The kill zone effect jumped ashore. Premiums and delays priced the project like a risk asset, not a pillar. Meanwhile, in the mangroves, the human bill collected in smaller numbers that felt larger. A mechanic hid with his nephew, both of them silent, except when the tide cracked roots like knuckles. A cook checked her phone for a message that said payroll had run. It didn't. A guard who'd spent months at the gate realized the gate could not keep the world out if the world arrived by canoe and dry foot. Families waited for calls from husbands who had learned to stop promising return dates. The project's perimeter had always been a line on the ground. The insurgency redrew it as a circle that moved. You could add soldiers, you could issue statement, but the currents off the beach and the currents in local life ignored both. A convoy might clear at dawn and stall by noon because a fisherman's skiff had drifted sideways across an inlet, and everyone was afraid to ask who was in it. A fuel tanker might make it to the last checkpoint and turn back because the escort commander counted heads and didn't like the number. Here's where the math cut both ways. Onshore, everyday loss didn't just idle crews, it rewrote financing. Debt service clocks didn't pause. Insurance for worksites ticked higher as incident reports stacked up. Milestone payments slipped, and with them the small companies that lived between invoice and receipt. Some packed up and left. Others waited too long and found that waiting was the thing that broke them. Politicians flew in for photos and flew out with promises that sounded like plans. Regional troops arrived with uniforms that looked crisp against the dust. Patrols swept roads and pushed markets open for a week, sometimes two. But the sea states still decided whether a resupply made it to shore, and the fear states still decided whether a bus driver finished a route. The fix that sounded simple, send troops, met the same hard edges that turned captains around offshore. Timing, weather, and people who have to live with the consequences of a bad call. Meanwhile, the story that sold the project, jobs, clinics, classrooms, Frayed, community leaders who had vouched for opportunities found themselves explaining delays they didn't control. Recruiters for the insurgency didn't need speeches. They only needed to point at idle hands and empty markets. Security outsourcing meant to add capacity, sometimes added distance. Guards without local ties saw shadows where fishermen saw relative. Each misunderstanding made cooperation more expensive. From the perspective of buyers thousands of miles away, the change was a line on a spreadsheet. Deliveries deferred, prices hedged, alternate cargoes booked at a premium. From the perspective of a welder who'd sent his first remittance home and now watched the camp empty, it was a life rerouted by men he'd never meet. The corridor between those two views, the market and the mangrove, was exactly where the project lived and died day to day. They tried to buy time with concrete and confidence. The currents had other plans. Currents, monsoons, and the physics of delay. While soldiers mapped roads ashore, the sea drew its own map in moving water. South of the Rovuma mouth, the Agulhas Current gathered speed like a river pressed against a cliff. It looked calm from a distance, a polished sheen on blue. Up close, it was a treadmill set just a notch too fast, throwing cross seams where local eddies met the main flow. Pilots knew those lines. They also knew that every extra knot under the keel stole maneuvering room you couldn't buy back. Now remember, this is the channel where seasons decide what counts as possible. Cyclones don't need a landfall to shut things down. A passing system lifts swell that turns beach landings into coin tosses. Small patrol craft hit their limits first. At 2 meters of swell with a confused chop, the ride becomes survival, not surveillance. Add darkness, and you've built the perfect blind zone. Radar bouncing off a jagged shoreline, sea clutter blooming across screens, and human eyes reduced to guessing at shapes between whitecaps. Here's where it gets technical in a way that punishes pride. Automatic identification system signals are optional for the boats that cause the most trouble. Dhows working the inshore waters often run dark or with hand-me-down transponders that flicker. A skiff tucked into the wind shadow of a reef barely paints on radar at all, especially if the operator trims speed to match the swell. Meanwhile, a legitimate fishing crew dragging nets at 3 knots looks exactly like a problem until you're close enough to see faces. Close enough might be too close. On a Tuesday night, different ship, different captain, the escort plotted a dogleg approach behind a sand spit to break the swell. The math said it would shave 20 minutes and reduce exposure. The sea said otherwise. A cross-set current slid both vessels toward a shallow patch that hadn't been dredged since the last big blow. Turning out of that slide in the dark is more art than seamanship, and art is expensive when you misjudge. The captain flattened the turn, widened the arc, and gave up the time. The convoy missed the tide by 30 minutes. The berth closed. The slot was reassigned. The invoice didn't care that he'd saved the hull. Meanwhile, 200 meters inshore, a skiff used the same physics in reverse. Leeward of the reef, the water went glassy between sets. The outboard popped once, then settled into a cough that barely moved the boat. From a mile out, it looked like another fisherman nursing old gear. From 100 meters, it looked like someone waiting to time a dash. The escort's thermal camera flared against the warm rocks and lost the colder hull in the background noise. By the time they retasked the light, the skiff had slid back into chop, used a swell to mask wake, and vanished behind a dhow that had every right to be there. This is the moment everything changed for scheduling. A 6-hour weather hold at anchor rolled the approach into a different tide. That missed tide punted the arrival into a queue shaped by other people's delays, their own cyclones, their own blind zones. One slip cascaded, pilots reassigned, tugs on other jobs, customs windows lapsed. The ship took a slow loop offshore to wait, burning boil-off and patience. The escort on crew hour limits returned to base. The second escort couldn't launch in that sea state. Everyone did their job. The plans still failed. What nobody knew at the time, not in a way that stuck, was how predictable the unpredictability had become. Monsoon pulses had boxcar rhythms. The Agulhas shed eddies like clockwork downstream. Patrol commanders kept informal ledgers, nights you could run, nights you shouldn't, and nights you'd try because the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Insurgents didn't need to read oceanography papers. They watched who moved when the wind swung and learned the beats faster than planners admitted. Unknown to them, across town, the port agent refreshed a dashboard that blended weather, security advisories, and the latest from insurers. When the Lloyd's Joint War Committee note hit inboxes after a string of shoreline incidents, it wasn't a ban. It was a headwind layered onto the swell. Captains who might have gambled in May took the long way in June. Owners added routing clauses. Charterers stopped pressing. The sea didn't close with mines. It closed with math that turned every gust into a reason to wait. In the aftermath of one too many holds, crews hardened their rules. Night approaches needed 2 escorts, not 1. 2 escorts meant twice the maintenance, twice the exposure. Maintenance slipped when weather stole windows. Exposure rose when windows narrowed. That loop didn't need a gunshot to tighten. It needed seasons, currents, and human limits. And while the sea slowed escorts, money moved faster than navies ever could. The insurance squeeze, how a spreadsheet closed a sea. While the sea rewrote timetables, the market rewrote the map. It started with an email that looked routine, a Lloyd's Joint War Committee update, just a few lines expanding a high-risk area to cover waters off Cabo Delgado after a run of shoreline incidents. It did not order anyone to stop sailing. It did something colder. It moved a decimal. War risk premiums are quiet levers. A captain can eyeball a swell. Nobody eyeballs a premium that triples overnight. The owners saw it first. The add-on for a single transit spiked from a rounding error to a line item that wrecked the voyage economics. If you added armed guards, your hull insurer wanted proof of compliance with flag state rules and local law. If you did not, the premium went higher or cover narrowed to the point of parity. Reinsurers, those invisible balance sheets behind the first line of insurers, pulled back capital and raised attachment points. Retrocession dried up. A polite way of saying the backstop said, "Not today." Clauses that used to sit like fine print moved to center stage. Breach warranties meant your cover vanished if you strayed a mile into a red zone without pre-approval. Deviation penalties turned a weather diversion into a billing grenade. Kidnap and ransom riders, once negotiated by a separate team with a separate vocabulary, suddenly attached to hull and war. Everyone wanted to know, who is on watch? What is your escort plan? How fast can you get to blue water if the shoreline lights go out? Port risk is its own beast. Mocimboa de Praia, scarred by earlier seizures, slid into blacklists and grey guidance. P&I clubs raised deductibles for calls there, effectively asking owners to swallow more of the pain if anything went wrong. Tug operators demanded cash up front. Pilots wanted guarantees that could not be given. On paper, the port was not closed. In practice, doors were locked by cost. What nobody knew at the time was how fast the math would cascade beyond one coastline. A buyer in Europe pushed back. "Do not tender a bill for a premium spike we did not agree to." An owner replied, "We will not ballast into a red zone without cover." A charterer sat in the middle, juggling availability lists that shrank by the hour. The spreadsheet turned human choices into a corridor that narrowed until only the most desperate or most insured would pass. Get this, one ship's hesitation becomes a fleet's habit. After the update, a major owner circulated new standing orders. No night entries, no inshore waits without 2 escorts, no calls unless premiums are pre-funded. Captains, already skittish from missed tides, now had a policy shield. Denial of approach was not a personal failure, it was compliance, and compliance made refusal contagious. Meanwhile, brokers tried to stitch exemptions. If you could show enhanced security, extra escorts, local liaison, shore beacons, crew drills, you might shave a point off the premium. But each add-on carried its own risk and its own price. Armed teams raised liability if anything went wrong near civilian dhows. Unarmed presence satisfied nobody. Rotary wing support looked great in presentations and wilted under fuel ranges and monsoon ceilings. Every fix looked good until the current swung or the phone rang with another report of small boat harassment near an inlet. Reinsurers watched the pattern widen. After Nord Stream's shocks reset how people thought about subsea risk, without asserting who did it, models started to price infrastructure exposure differently. An LNG lane near fragile flow lanes and umbilicals did not look like a normal coastal passage anymore. You were not just moving a ship. You were skirting assets that could turn into months-long outages if struck by accident, anchor, or intent. The war risk rider that once covered hull and crew now had footnotes that read like a treaty. Owners adapted the only way they could. They rerouted or walked. A Cape Detour looked absurd on a gas carrier until the alternative was a redlined approach that invalidated cover. Each extra day at sea burned boil-off and bunker, lifted emissions tallies, and pulled the ship out of the spot market for longer. But a loss without insurance was career-ending. You can argue with weather, you do not argue with a rejected claim. For crews, the shift showed up in briefings. Here is the new track. Here is what we will not do. Here is why your family's mortgage depends on us saying no to pretty coastline at dusk. For local agents, it showed up as silence. The call that used to say, pilot in 2 hours, became, we are not coming. Markets are loud when they chase opportunity. They are quiet when they leave. In the aftermath, spot prices flickered, then surged. Buyers downstream ate the increase because lights do not care about memos from London. Traders hedged what they could and paid what they had to. The Mozambique Channel did not close with patrol boats. It closed because a committee changed a list, because reinsurers followed their models, and because a dozen clauses finally meant what they said. The ocean drew the outlines. Europe's bet, LNG lifeline with a frayed cord. While spreadsheets in London were closing lanes, thermostats in Europe were dictating politics. After 2022, the order was blunt: cut dependence on Russian molecules. Ministers talked diversification. Traders talked volumes. Everyone stared at the same short list of places that could move the needle fast. Mozambique's Rovuma Basin, with a headline potential of 100 to 180 trillion cubic feet, glowed like a promise on winter maps. Here's where contracts turn hope into pressure. Utilities inked long-term offtake for stability, 15 to 20 years that made bankers smile, then chased spot flexibility to survive price spikes. Destination clauses mattered. If you could redirect a cargo from Asia to Europe when the Dutch title transfer facility screamed, you paid up front for that option. If you could not, you begged someone who could. In back rooms, schedulers built mosaics. Qatar long-term anchors, United States Gulf flexibility, West Africa swing volumes, and a Mozambique wedge that would grow into a pillar, eventually. But eventually met reality. Floating storage and regasification units latched onto quaysides from the Baltic to the Adriatic in record time. Politicians cut ribbons and declared victory. Then buyers stared at the other end of the pipe. Feedstock is not an announcement. It is a ship that shows up on time, again and again. With the Afungi project sliding toward 2028 through 2030, Mozambique's wedge shrank on the delivery curve. The pillar became a placeholder, and the kill zone premium became policy. Price taught the lesson the hard way. The Dutch title transfer facility swung like a metronome with a broken spring. A missed cargo in November did not just bruise a chart. It cascaded into gas-fired plants easing off, grid operators juggling reserves, and industrial users offered pay-to-curtail deals that felt like surrender. A cold snap layered onto that, and suddenly the math turned political. Which city dimmed lights first? Which factory took the hit? Which minister explained why a regas unit sat half idle because upstream risk had moved a decimal no one could bargain with? Get this, a utility trader in Central Europe stared at two screens, one flashing a premium offer from a West African cargo that could land inside 5 days, the other showing a cheaper Mozambique lift that might slip. The phone buzzed with a grid operator's warning. The trader swallowed the premium. Ratepayers would foot it in the next cycle. The newsroom would call it profiteering. The alternative was a rolling blackout at dinner time. Nobody survives that headline in January. Meanwhile, everyone watched the quiet race between projects. Qatar added capacity with the predictability of a metronome. The United States Gulf kept printing cargoes from brownfield expansions that hit their marks. Mozambique, for all its geology, fell behind on the only timeline that mattered to a buyer. This quarter, next quarter, the one after that. In meetings, risk officers circled Rovuma and wrote in the margin, promising, not bankable yet. Back on the coast, Coral Sul, the floating lifeline, proved a point but not a system. Proof of life cargoes sailed, celebrated as evidence that the basin was real. Buyers smiled at the photos, then flipped to pages that asked about baseload reliability and scale. Could this cover a winter dip? Could it anchor a portfolio without demanding a volatility tax? Not yet, not at the size that bent curves. Here's the irony: Europe did not advertise. The scramble for non-Russian gas hardened the same spreadsheet habits that choked the Mozambique lane. Safety margins widened, war risk filters tightened, compliance hardened into culture. Buyers wrote procurement rules that forbade certain zones unless premiums were pre-funded and escorts pre-booked. Those rules traveled with the contracts. A risk label that started as an insurer's caution ended as a utility board's policy. Meanwhile, destination clauses became weapons and shields. Sellers who could swing cargoes chased the richest netback, often Asia, when Europe thought it had first refusal. Buyers who locked in firm volumes paid a boredom premium for security. Those who played spot roulette won until they lost, then paid twice, once at the hub, once at the ballot box. What nobody knew at the time was how fast small detours would pile into system fragility. Hormuz jitters, Red Sea scares, and Cape congestion stole days that portfolios could not spare. The Mozambique gap magnified each wobble. If Rovuma had delivered on the early promise, a dozen tight weeks might have felt like weather. Without it, weather felt like strategy breaking. Europe's pivot was not wrong, it was urgent. It was also built on corridors that seas and spreadsheets could close. On cold mornings, the map looked simple: terminals here, ships there, molecules flowing. By afternoon, the inbox told the truth: premiums up, windows narrow, pilots busy, war risk rider unchanged. Every decision moved a bill, every bill moved a vote. In boardrooms, someone always asked the same question: when does Mozambique arrive as more than a headline? The answer slid along the calendar toward 2028, then 2029, then 2030. Traders built bridges with expensive planks. Citizens paid to cross them. The lifeline held, but it frayed where a narrow sea, a hard market, and a conflict onshore had braided themselves into a wall no navy could lower. The route deal, promises, permits, and a powder keg. To understand why the corridor hardened, we need to go back to the first signatures, when promises outpaced the tide. In the late 201s and early 202s, discovery headlines sprinted ahead of logistics. Rovuma's 100 to 180 trillion cubic feet became shorthand for inevitability. Renders showed gleaming trains and perfect roads. Brochures said prosperity would arrive on a schedule. The ink promised a future that steel and weather would later have to earn. Onshore, the map got redrawn with pen before it could be staked with rebar. Concession lines carved through farms and cashew groves, through village paths that doubled as lifelines. Compensation tables followed, dense with forms and deadlines, thinner on clarity. A fisherman could point to his tide and his catch. He could not point to a formula that said how many meticais a reef was worth if his landing beach moved 2 kilometers down a coast he did not control. Permits multiplied. For some, they were tickets to a job site with a day rate worth bragging about. For others, they were invisible gates. No paper, no passage, no passage, no market, no season. Artisanal fisheries took the hit no one priced. Dredging for channels shifted silt and buried nearshore grasses. Patrol lines pushed canoes off familiar grounds. Nets tore on new hazards that did not belong to the sea. When you fish for food rather than for export, a lost morning is not a statistic. It is a meal gone. Security followed the money. Contracts went to firms with radios, trucks, and training slides. They brought perimeter beams, rosters, and rules of force. They did not bring uncles, cousins, or childhood stories that make small misunderstandings harmless. A guard without a shared language calls in a report. A cousin defuses it with a laugh. The first option scales on a spreadsheet. The second one scales in a community. Recruiters learned the gap before the planners did. They took your beach. They closed your path. They said you'd get a job. Where is it? The pitch wrote itself. Meanwhile, government balance sheets counted future gas like current cash. Revenue models toured donor conferences and cabinet rooms. Roads were promised against royalties not yet earned. Clinics were pledged from taxes not yet collected. Patronage networks swelled to meet a payday still offshore. Expectations rose faster than pilings. When ground broke, the crowd clapped. When ground paused, the crowd asked why. Each delay moved hope into the kind of anger that finds direction. Here's a micro-story that stayed off the tender lists. A cooperative of 30 fishers pooled money for a fiberglass hull after a liaison meeting promised better landings and fuel vouchers. The vouchers came twice. The new landing was still a construction pad covered in rebar. Guards turned them away at dusk, then at noon, then at dusk again, citing safety. One man's boat sat on blocks while he borrowed back his old dugout. He went from 3 trips a day to 1. By the 3rd week, his oldest boy quit school because school fees wait for no one. In town halls, officials spoke about timelines that sounded clean. This quarter we mobilize, next quarter we pour. In kitchens, the calendar sounded different. This week we eat fish if the swell drops. The lie's origin was not in malice, it was in speed. Gas equals instant development made sense on a podium. It did not survive procurement cycles, monsoons, or the solvent of distrust. Each unmet pledge became a recruiting line. Each rumor about who got paid and who did not became a wedge. What nobody knew at the time, or did not say aloud, was how close the onshore and offshore debts were to maturity. The hidden loan scandal from earlier in the decade had already thinned trust and tightened aid. Communities were primed to doubt signatures. Investors were primed to price risk. When the first convoys stalled and the first payouts lagged, neither side gave much grace. The tide turned faster because the basin's politics were already brackish. The debt came due, onshore and offshore, at the same time. And when it did, the wall did not look like concrete. It looked like a permit stamp, a torn net, a rumor, and a promise that arrived 2 seasons late. Debt, FX, and the LNG mirage. While excavators were tracing the footprint of a new future on the coast, the country's balance sheet was carrying a past it could not outrun. Between 2013 and 2014, 3 state-backed companies took on loans that added up to roughly $2 billion, about 12% of Mozambique's economy at the time. Much of it stayed off the books. When the numbers surfaced in 2016, aid froze, trust cracked, and the Metical slid. Growth halved. Inflation bit. Creditors started their sentences with the same word, conditionality. The social fallout didn't stop at spreadsheets, it fed recruitment. With prices up, jobs delayed, and compensation distrusted, the hidden loans scandal became the insurgents' best talking point. They stole your future, we'll pay you today. Here's where the offshore dream met the onshore bill. Investors who had flown in to celebrate reserves began to underline words like governance. Lenders rewrote term sheets. The government's promises around gas revenues, already pledged forward in speeches and soft commitments, ran into a wall of skepticism. The scandal did not sink the resource, it taxed the runway. Every dollar of new capital wanted a higher return to clear the new perception of risk. Each point added to the risk premium took a bite out of the internal rate of return. Projects still penciled, but the eraser marks showed. FX risk was the quiet drumbeat beneath the headlines. The capex was dollarized, steel, turbines, subsea kit, specialized labor flown in from everywhere. Livelihoods along the coast were paid in meticais. When the currency moved, a bag of cement doubled for a local subcontractor, while the foreign invoice looked the same on paper. Wages lagged prices. Fuel bit deeper. Shopkeepers changed chalkboards too often to keep up. That gap does not show on a satellite photo of a shiny plant. It shows in kitchens, where cooking oil lasts 2 fewer days each month. Local content rules were supposed to turn geology into jobs, and some did, but bottlenecks piled up at the points where global supply chains meet small firms that run on breath and hope. A welding outfit that had finally passed certification waited on a milestone payment that slid because a security incident pushed a site inspection. Rent was due anyway. The owner sold his truck to make payroll, assuming the check would land next week. It didn't. 2 weeks later, the landlord changed the locks. A badge that had opened gates now opened nothing. Meanwhile, schedule slips compounded like interest. Each month lost to a road closure or a weather window missed added to overhead. Insurance for works in progress adjusted upward with every incident report. Penalties hid in clauses nobody read aloud at groundbreakings. A procurement officer tried to resequence deliveries to save cost, only to discover that a critical valve had a lead time measured in quarters, not weeks. The spreadsheet went from green to yellow to red, while the camera crews had already left. Investors are not sentimental about geology. They do math on people. Aid agencies remembered 2016 when donors stepped back and the economy's floor dropped. Banks remembered headlines about bribes and missing millions. Every meeting began with assurances that controls were tighter now, that the offtake was bankable, that the security perimeter would hold. The story was not false. It was competing with a different story, that a $2 billion hole had taught everyone to demand a thicker cushion. On the coast, that same hole taught young men to switch from waiting in hiring lines to taking cash stipends from recruiters. Here's the human side of interest rates. A teacher's pension fund in Europe, indirectly invested through a sovereign bond, read about the hidden loans in the morning paper and called the asset manager. The manager rebalanced the portfolio, shaving exposure. A rating agency adjusted its outlook. Months later, a ministry tried to raise money for a road that would supply the gas site and found the price slightly worse than expected. The road cost more because the debt had cost more because the loans had been hidden years earlier. The asphalt did not care. The villagers waiting for the road did. As the insurgency pressed and the insurers tightened, the market layered caution on top of caution. Equity partners asked for contingencies stacked 3 high. Lenders wanted guarantees from counterparties with stronger shoulders. Each safeguard made sense alone. Together, they slowed the very momentum they were designed to protect. Meanwhile, contractors with thin balance sheets bent until they cracked. A young accountant at a local firm took calls from suppliers she knew by first name. She asked for 1 more week. She ran the same line the next week. By the 3rd, her boss told her to stop picking up. What nobody knew at the time was how neatly the macro and micro would snap into place. The hidden loan scandal had drained credibility. The currency moves had drained purchasing power. The war risk premiums had drained appetite, and the tide had drained the working day. The LNG dream had not died. It had gone from sprint to marathon without changing shoes. So when people asked why the corridor felt like a wall, the answer lived in margins as much as in men with guns. Trust was a currency, and it had devalued. Dollars were the scaffolding, and they had grown more expensive. The sea imposed physics. The market imposed memory, and both waited for proof that this time the numbers would hold. Navies on a sandbar, why force can't seal the gap? So if markets could close a sea with premiums, could soldiers pry it back open with force? On paper, yes. In practice, the shoreline answered with sandbars, law, and physics. Start with the map the admirals hate: 3 overlapping jurisdictions, territorial seas, where a state's law rules, an exclusive economic zone beyond that, where rights are fuzzier, and then the gray zone where private security teams ride shotgun but can't shoot first without turning a contract into a courtroom. A captain wants clarity. A lawyer hands him a flowchart. Every box on that chart is time, and time near a hostile coast is risk. Capacity sounds like metal and horsepower. It lives in fuel tanks and crew rosters. Patrol boats can sprint, but they can't loiter without a tender somewhere calm, with spare parts and mechanics who can find a cracked impeller by touch at 2 in the morning. Helicopters extend eyes and range, until night, weather and duty hour ceilings pull them home. Night vision gear helps until spray salts the lenses and a thermal camera turns a warm coastline into glare. You can surge for a week. You can't surge for a season without something giving. Now shift your shoes to the mud, reefs stitched together with mangroves and river mouths to build a labyrinth that punishes anything larger than a skiff. Sandbars shift after a storm, moving channels 50 meters overnight. A 5-knot current beside a flat patch of water hides a rip that will knock a fast boat sideways into teeth you didn't see on yesterday's chart. Local fishermen read those tells without words. A visiting patrol reads them with dents. Rules of engagement ride shotgun on every patrol. Near civilian dhows, force asks for precision that small boat fights don't give. A wrong call means dead neighbors and headlines that erase any tactical win. A cautious call means a skiff ghosts away under a sail that looked legal from just far enough that you couldn't prove otherwise. Escorts slow, convoys wait. The invisible wall tightens. Here's a micro-story the briefings never quite solved. Dusk, a choppy inshore lane, a convoy stacked for a quick dash. An escort spots a skiff hunting the eddy line, outboard coughing like bad fuel. The playbook says warn, approach, deter. The law says do not escalate near civilian traffic. The sea says your turn radius just doubled in this swell. The escort throws a light, the skiff dips behind a dhow, and by the time the move is clean enough to justify a hard intercept, the convoy's safe speed rule has burned the window. Nobody fires, nobody wins. The slot ashore times out. The insurer later calls it prudent seamanship. The newspaper calls it timidity. Both missed the point. The shoreline wrote the outcome. Meanwhile, unknown to the escorts, a district administrator phones a regional task force about a night operation ashore. Jurisdictions collide. Naval assets are tasked to support a sweep inland, then retasked back to sea when a call comes about harassment near an inlet. You can't be in both places at once. That choice, shore or surf, repeats until commanders start protecting what they can guarantee, tomorrow's readiness, not tonight's gamble. Private maritime security companies try to fill the steam. Some ride aboard with non-lethal kits and radios that actually work. Others come with rifles and legal headaches. Flag states differ, coastal states differ more. One contract clause says guards disembark before territorial waters. Another says remain until lines are fast. A weather delay slides the handoff into darkness. The boat refuses to wait inshore. The guards refuse to leave offshore. Everyone is right. The ship sits. From their perspective, navies measure success as absence. No attacks, no losses, no scandals. Insurgents measure success as presence. One rumor, one chase, one missed tide that reprices a week of calls. You don't need to sink a ship to close a lane. You need to make enough captains believe the next hour is the wrong hour to try. Get this, the sandbar beats the destroyer because the destroyer can't enter the fight it was built to win. Blue water tonnage looks good on a pier. It looks useless when the engagement envelope is a reef alley at 12 knots with a dozen civilian hulls in the frame. Literal craft help until maintenance hours eat sorties and crews burn out on false positives. Big fleets can project power. They can't guarantee Tuesdays at dusk next to a mangrove line. What nobody knew at the time, at least not in writing, was how much the insurance memo amplified the rules of engagement. When war risk listings shaded the chart, a commander's cautious call aligned perfectly with an owner's new standing order. Avoid, delay, refuse. Force didn't fail. It obeyed its own constraints while finance finished the job. In the aftermath, admirals asked for sensors, law changes, more hulls. They got some of each. The sea kept its veto. Currents still carved blind spots. Weather still shut down rotors. Dhows still owned plausible innocence. And the corridor stayed closed, not by blockade, but by a mosaic of limits that turned presence into theater and schedules into hope. They tried a workaround, float the floating gamble, and outrun the insurgency. FLNG versus the shore. They tried a workaround, move the plant offshore, put steel over deep water, and shorten the distance between wellhead and ship to something a skiff couldn't touch. Coral Sul anchored that idea in metal, a floating liquefied natural gas unit moored far from the mangrove maze, processing gas above the same seabed that onshore plans had hoped to tap. The pitch was clean. If roads blade, skip roads. If fences fail, float the fence. From a distance, Coral Sul looked like certainty, lights burning through sea mist, flares timing breaths against the swell, a gantry that turned molecules into cargo. Proof of life cargoes sailed, and for a moment the basin felt bankable again. Buyers clipped the photos for decks. Bankers added a slide that said, yes, output exists. The milestone mattered, but milestones do not run winters. They mark starts, not scale. Here's where the offshore fix met the ocean's rules. Maintenance windows don't ask permission. A compressor goes warm, a valve shows a number you don't like. A predictive sensor flags a vibration you can't ignore. Onshore, you roll a truck. Offshore, you schedule a shutdown with a weather window and an evacuation drill rehearsed until it lives in muscle memory. Every drill steals hours from production. Every hour shaved for safety buys you sleep you need, but cargo you don't ship. Weather holds write their own scripture. A clean transfer to a support vessel needs more than calm seas. It needs stable crosswinds, predictable swell period, and a captain aboard who has seen ugly enough to say no when yes would look brave. A stubborn squall line eats a shift. A cyclone season eats a month. The floating plant isn't running from insurgents, but it still answers to monsoons, currents, and the same Agulhas logic that turns good plans into maybes. Now follow the tale that keeps a floating plant alive. Crew changes don't teleport. They ride helicopters when weather smiles and boats when it sulks. A sick child at home, an exhausted engineer timing out on duty hours, a key specialist stuck ashore because the last leg of the chain went red. Each human detail builds delay into systems that hate delay. Stores need moving, filters, gaskets, welding rods, the thousand small parts that never make press releases. Subsea integrity needs eyes. Remotely operated vehicles crawling along umbilicals, divers on rare clear days, sensors that read pressure like a cardiologist reads a pulse. One anomalous reading pushes a campaign forward and everything else sideways. Here's a micro story with numbers behind it. A crew boat runs late on a swell that isn't dangerous, just rude. 2 rotations miss the handshake window on deck because the heave compensator is flirting with a limit the safety officer won't bend. 12 specialists sleep onshore in a facility built for 8. The next morning's weather is worse. A small inspection campaign slides 48 hours. The planner reshuffles tasks, robbing a future window to patch the present. No headlines. Just capacity trimmed in the margins until the margin feels like policy. Economics keep score. A floating plant's capacity can't match a shore-based megaproject with a parade of trains. Cash flow lands in smaller bites, on schedules that weather edits. For a buyer that matters, baseload asks for rhythm, not cameos. A proof-of-life cargo buys confidence, then demands a pattern. Traders stare at delivery curves and ask the questions that make managers shift in chairs. How often, how steady, how fast can you bounce back after a shutdown? The answers are better than nothing and worse than a mainland's ambition. Security isn't gone offshore, it's transformed. You moved away from rifles in the treeline to questions with wrenches and winches. Sabotage risk looks different but doesn't vanish. Anchors drag in storms, trawlers wander. A careless tow can nick a line you only find by pressure drop and a camera in the dark. The war risk rider that used to glare at convoys now reads footnotes about subsea architecture and exclusion zones. Escorts shift from guns to guards in rain, gear checking badges, and line handlers rehearsing what-ifs. Meanwhile, the shore kept asking where the jobs went. A floating unit hires, but not like a city of concrete does. The multiplier changes shape. Local contracts pivot to marine logistics, catering, maintenance tenders that need certifications some firms don't have yet. The project still spends, but it spends on different skills at a distance. Promise maps redraft again, and leaders who vouched for a boom find themselves explaining a trickle that floats. From the perspective of the basin, Coral Sul is both bridge and bet. It says to markets, we can lift gas in the teeth of an insurgency. It whispers a caveat at volumes that prove a point, not fulfill a promise. From the perspective of a utility planner staring at winter, the distinction matters. Portfolio anchors need mass. Floating units offer agility. Agility is priceless in a crisis and insufficient as a plan. What nobody knew at the time was how much reassurance a handful of steady sailings could buy, and how fast that reassurance would evaporate after the first forced shutdown that lined up with a storm, a tight market, and a nervous insurer. Offshore, the factory floats. Under it, the vulnerabilities do too. And while the platform solved the shoreline problem, another front opened under the waterline. Subsea vulnerabilities, cables, pipelines, and accidents. Meanwhile, under Coral Sol's hull and beneath the planned export lanes, a second battlefield stretched in silence. Flow lanes carried hot gas from seabed wells to manifolds no tourist would ever see. Control umbilicals, bundles of fiber optics, hydraulics and power, ran like nerves across a body no one could touch with bare hands. An export route, once a line on a map, was now steel-threaded over canyons, laid with tolerances that measured in millimeters and consequences that measured in months. Here's where the sea's everyday mess becomes strategic. Trawlers drag gear that bites deeper than intended. Anchors skip across sand until they don't, catching on what engineers hoped would stay invisible. A tow in bad weather takes a wider arc and cuts a corner straight over a zone marked "Avoid" on a chart someone didn't load. Each accident reads like a shrug until pressure drops on a dashboard and a control room goes quiet enough to hear chairs shift. The lessons that rippled from the Nord Stream shock weren't about who did what. They were about how fragile looked on a balance sheet. After that blast, models everywhere started to price Subsea like an Achilles heel. Insurers who once lumped infrastructure into a broad hull and war category began carving it into footnoted exposures: flowline integrity, umbilical vulnerability, near-shore crossing risk. The war risk rider that already sat heavy over the Mozambique Channel now carried annexes that read like a checklist of ways a quiet line could fail. A micro-story from a Tuesday nobody remembers proves the point. A coastal trawler, battered and legal, loses a door in a squall and hauls harder to save the net. The skipper, tired and guessing, lays out scope on the anchor he never uses there. The anchor bites, skids, then catches. Onshore, a subsea engineer sees a subtle signature change. Pressure flickers out of rhythm on a leg of line that should be boring. The team flags it, slows flow, and spins up an inspection with a remotely operated vehicle. The weather disagrees. 2 days pass. By the time the camera finds the scar, it is worse than hoped, better than feared. A shutdown window opens and the delivery curve bends. Here's the timing sting. Spare parts for a subsea tree or a critical valve don't live in a closet. They live in catalogs with lead times that laugh at urgency. Fabrication clocks run in months, not weeks. The right alloy isn't on a shelf. The weld certification needs a name you can't rush. Even when spares exist, the lift plan, vessel booking, and crew certification stack like dominoes that topple in slow motion. A single cut, a sliced umbilical, a gouged line turns into a season staring at Gantt charts. Detection is its own trap. Sonar paints shapes, algorithms flag anomalies, patrols feed possible interference notes to inboxes that never sleep. But water is loud, thermoclines bend sound, shrimp crackle like static. A school of fish can look for a heartbeat like intent. You can flood a corridor with sensors and still miss the one trawl door that swings low on a night when the swell hides its bite. You can train crews to call in every odd ping and still drown in noise you cannot action. Regulators try to fix the gap with lines on charts, exclusion zones, no trawl corridors, transit lanes with fines attached. Enforcement stalls on the same physics that humbled escorts near the mangroves. Small boats don't broadcast. Big nets aren't polite. A patrol catamaran writes warnings until fuel runs low, then writes fewer. Fishermen, squeezed off grounds they've worked for decades, push against lines they never agreed to. A mistake becomes a grievance. A grievance becomes a dare. Somewhere in that drift, a line gets nicked. Insurers adapt by pricing behavior. Show them integrity management plans that live, not laminate. Pressure trending, pigging schedules, corrosion mapping, diver logs. Show them community liaison that works as more than a brochure. Fishermen who know where the lines lie and why. Compensation that arrives before tempers curdle, radios that answer. Premiums shade down when proof stacks up, shade up when it doesn't. The Joint War Committee's wider listing is the weather. Your practices are the sail trim. Get both wrong and you pay a storm tax, even on calm days. Meanwhile, the market keeps its own clock. An off-taker does not care if the excuse is an anchor scar or a rumored skiff. They care that a cargo slid right when hub prices were meanest. A trader reroutes from a longer, safer lane and eats carbon penalties that will show up in next year's audit. A minister asks why a cable cut 300 meters under the sea means a blackout 6,000 kilometers away. The truthful answer, because physics and procurement calendars doesn't travel well. What nobody knew at the time was how much small, verified trust could close the gap. In one pilot stretch, A cooperative of fishers carried cheap transponders issued with training and a hotline that paid for early warnings. A trawler raised a hand before a tow, skirting a flagged polygon by 100 meters. The call cost a minute. It saved a month. An insurer noted the metric, not the story, and shaved a point. A ship called at dusk, it would have skipped. Underwater, the wall isn't a barricade. It's the sum of brittle lines, slow spares, noisy sensors, and habits, good or bad. Ships see nothing, markets see everything, and a single accident can write a season in red. The Detour economy, rerouting, choke point overload, new fragilities. And then the market did what navies couldn't, it rerouted the world. When the Mozambique lane shaded red on insurers, charts and buyers' rules, cargoes didn't stop. They bent. More liftings leaned on Qatar's steady cadence, on the United States Gulf's flexible trains, on West Africa's swing volumes. Schedulers drew longer arcs, stacked buffers, and tried to keep the orchestra in time while adding miles to every instrument's path. Each detour sounded rational until the second-order choke points cleared their throats. The Strait of Hormuz, always a stress test, saw another notch of anxiety priced in with every headline. A minor incident could turn a line of tankers into a parking lot. Bab el-Mandeb, the narrow gate to the Red Sea, turned jittery whenever conflicts onshore flared or drones found targets. The Suez Canal kept its usual rhythm, until a gust, a grounding, or a queue reminded everyone it's a single lane with global consequences. And the Cape of Good Hope, the pressure valve of last resort, took on convoys that never planned to round it, piling days and bunker bills onto voyages that used to pencil easily. Here's where the detour economy shows its hidden teeth. Bunker costs jump when you run long, and liquefied natural gas carriers burn their own boil-off to make speed. Add a week and you don't just buy fuel, you sacrifice future availability. The ship you needed next Tuesday is now next Friday, and the cargo that depended on that slot becomes a headache that ripples through 3 customers and 2 ports. Emissions accounting catches up too. A portfolio that looked clean on paper starts to show a carbon profile regulators will notice. Carbon pricing turns stubborn, and traders fold those costs back into offers ratepayers will one day see. Meanwhile, price geography tightens like a vice. Asia's pull competes with Europe's fear, and arbitrage windows slam shut faster than they open. A cargo that made sense for Europe at dawn belongs to Asia by lunch, as the Japan-Korea marker edges past the Dutch title transfer facility. Destination clauses and fleet positions become fate. If you're too far west with the wrong permissions, you can watch profit evaporate while doing everything right. Get this, an LNG carrier crosses the Mediterranean aiming for Suez, slot penciled, pilots briefed. A weather hiccup and a tug availability snag push the time window 6 hours. The Canal Authority reshuffles. 15 ships slide ahead. The LNG captain checks boil-off, calculates margins, and calls the owner. 2 choices: wait in line and nuke profits, or turn south and take the Cape. The Cape Detour adds 14 days in the current, maybe more if the Agulhas snarls. The owner chooses the long way, saves the claim, loses the quarter's bonus. Onshore, nobody applauds prudence. They just mark the delivery late and charge penalties tied to hub prices that pick the worst day to spike. Rerouting also strains the small, boring parts of the system that make big promises possible. Port slots at alternative terminals book out weeks sooner. Tugs and pilots hit ceilings. Laken's bunch. Even storage tanks learn stress when cargoes arrive unevenly, forcing operators to juggle send-out rates against safety margins that don't bend. One flared valve at a regas unit in the wrong hour can force a curtailment that shows up on a grid operator's dashboard as yet another red line. Insurers adjust in step. A shorter leg through a red zone replaced by a longer leg through 2 yellow ones can still cost more when total exposure hours multiply. War risk remains the headline, but navigational risk and congestion risk creep up the ledger. You didn't sail past insurgents. You sailed past storm tracks, drone rumor mills, and a swell pattern that eats schedules. The premium doesn't care why you were late. It prices the fact that you were. Meanwhile, chartering strategy turns defensive. Owners prefer time charters that iron out volatility. Charterers crave spot lift to exploit dips and dodge spikes. The Mozambique gap pushes both sides toward rigidity. Utilities lock in coverage just in case, inflating forward demand that might not materialize. Traders hedge harder, and hedges beget hedges until liquidity looks like strength and behaves like fragility. One shock, and unwinds get messy. Unknown to most desks, crews live the detour as fatigue. Longer legs mean longer watches. Whether south of the Cape is not a screenshot, it's sleet on the bridge wings and a list that won't quit. The chief keeps a nervous ledger of boiler hours. The second officer recalculates arrival windows while the cook stretches stores another day. Maintenance slated for a calm anchorage moves into a lurching sea and gets deferred. Deferred becomes backlog. Backlog becomes the next surprise nobody priced. From the perspective of a minister answering questions about high bills, it looks like greed. From the perspective of a scheduler staring at a mosaic of choke points, it looks like arithmetic with knives. Small moves elsewhere, an outage in Nigeria, a fog bank off Sabine Pass, a freight rally in the Atlantic, tilt portfolios because Mozambique's promised pillar isn't bearing weight yet. Here's the kicker: the detour economy works until it doesn't. It buys time, not stability. It spreads risk, but also spreads thin the very buffers that make energy systems resilient. You can route around a red lane for a season, do it for years, and you've built fragility into the map. And the bill for that fragility doesn't arrive at sea. It lands in living rooms, line items, community and elections. Firewall, the only wall that works. While ships lengthen their routes and insurers lengthen their clauses, the shortest line to safety sat in places maps barely name. The corridor never closed because boats were fast. It closed because people moved differently when trust snapped. Reopen that, and the sea stops being a rumor machine. Here's the simple, expensive truth. The only wall that holds in a narrow sea is built from dividends people can feel. Not promises, not renderings. Cash that arrives on time for things that matter now. Fishery protection that keeps nets whole. Cash for work that turns idle days into paid repairs. Clinics that stock medicine before a minister lands. The return shows up as information that's clean and early. Fishermen become censors because they have a reason to call. In one pilot inlet, a co-op voted to guard its grounds because the grounds finally paid them back. They logged skiff sightings on a cheap app that stamped time and tide. A radio channel, staffed by people who answered in the local language, cleared nets from designated approach corridors 2 hours before convoys ran. A captain who once saw a coastline of shadows now saw gaps open like doors. The war risk premium didn't vanish. It softened at the edges where proof replaced declarations. Transparent revenue sharing is the hinge. Not a percentage on paper, but posted ledgers, open meetings, and a rule that says money follows metrics you can count. If trawl incursions drop in a 6-kilometer box, stipends flow into the savings groups that keep boats afloat through bad months. If school attendance rises because the road is lit and safe, a line item renews. Miss the marks and the money clips. Everyone sees it. Everyone argues about it on the same day in the same room. Argument is not a problem, secrecy is. Security shifts from a perimeter to a pattern. Intel comes from relationships, not raids. A dhow captain who knows the liaison by name will whisper about a stranger's boat loitering near a reef that nobody loiters near. That tip gets paid, not once, but in a way that doesn't make him a target. Fuel vouchers, net repairs, a nephew hired for shore watch. Patrols stop sprinting blind. They move when the tide and the text both say go. Proof points exist, even if the coastline refuses copy-paste solutions. In deltas and archipelagos elsewhere, community-led fisheries management cut illegal tows by pairing enforcement with paydays that arrived faster than rumors. Not perfect. Better. The limit is always the same. When outsiders treat locals as optics, the program dies. When they treat them as partners with a veto, the map changes. Here's a micro-story you won't see in a prospectus. A teenage spotter, paid a modest stipend, sits on a dune at dusk with a radio and a thermos. He was headed for recruiters last year after school fees crushed his mother. Now his job is boring on purpose. 3 nights straight, nothing but gulls and a trawler that keeps its line. On the 4th, a skiff noses into the lee of a point it shouldn't. He calls the hotline. The liaison calls the patrol. The patrol shifts a quarter mile and shines a light that says, "Not tonight." The skiff turns away. No chase, no shoot. The convoy lands on time. The insurers don't hear the boy's name. They hear the metric: 4 clean nights, 1 deterred approach, 0 incidents, premium nudged down. The mechanism works because it pays faster than the insurgency recruits. Cash for work fixes the jetty before the storm season, hires the men most likely to be targeted, and ties the paycheck to a place they'd rather defend than abandon. Services that show up weekly beat speeches that arrive yearly. A repaired ice plant means better prices for fish, which means fewer midnight runs into risky grounds. The threat pool shrinks because boredom is earning again. Critics ask who funds this and why it should be the job of energy companies or faraway ratepayers. The answer is arithmetic with fewer funerals. A penny per million British thermal units layered into offtake, small enough to hide inside volatility, finances trust at a scale that moves needles. Investors get smoother curves and a story that fits environmental, social, and governance checklists without faking it. Insurers get behaviors they can price down. Governments get legitimacy that isn't borrowed from uniforms. Limits matter. Corruption can gut anything. That's why the whole thing lives or dies on transparency, enforced by people who can walk to the meeting and point at the ledger. It won't stop every ambush or calm every sea. It will make the rumors work for you more often than against you. From the perspective of a trader, this looks abstract. From the perspective of a captain who sees lanterns move off an approach channel because someone asked and someone paid, it's the difference between a missed tide and a hot meal at birth. From the perspective of a family that gets a clinic email saying the malaria meds are in because the stipend hit, it's proof that this lane is worth defending with the tools they have. Build that wall and the corridor reopens, not with destroyers, but with habits that make ships welcome again. The $20 trillion math, value at risk, and the payoff to prevention. So what is really at stake behind this narrow sea? Start with the rock beneath the waves. 100 to 180 trillion cubic feet in the Rovuma Basin. That is not a headline, it is a ledger. Stack present projects, expansions, and the downstream value of molecules that heat homes, power factories, and steady grids. Discount the future with rates bankers argue about. Add volatility taxes this channel keeps charging. The number that stares back is a notional $20 trillion of value at risk across decades. Now decision math. Build 3 scenarios. Best case, Cabo Delgado stabilizes, insurance softens, onshore trains restart near 2028 and ramp toward 2030, Coral Sul stays steady and subsea lines behave. Stalled case, insecurity flickers, war risk listings linger, restarts drift a year here, a year there, and buyers keep Mozambique as an optional extra, not a pillar. Sabotage case, a subsea strike or a port seizure slashes confidence, insurers retreat, reinsurance thins, and capital prices Mozambique like a hope, not a plan. In each branch, the same molecules exist. What changes is the discount the world slaps on getting them out. Here is the strange part. The cheapest fix sits far from turbines. Prevention's price looks like pennies per million British thermal units. A fractional surcharge braided into offtake funds the community firewall, the integrity playbook, and the quiet redundancies that stop hiccups from becoming headlines. Those pennies are small enough to hide inside normal price noise. The cost of not paying is not. Multi-dollar swings at hubs land in bills, bailouts, and elections. Investors do not love poetry. They love curves that stop twitching. Prevention turns a risky supply line into an asset insurers can price and buyers can schedule. Environmental, social, and governance screens are no longer just marketing. They are a test of whether your gas arrives. Build the co-op radios, the harbor beacons, the compensation fund that pays fast when a trawl door strays and prevents the second incident. Show receipts, not slogans. The reward is capital that returns and reinsurance that says yes. Get this, blended finance is not a buzzword here. It is a wiring diagram. Development banks underwrite the community dividend. Commercial lenders tie tranche releases to third-party verified metrics, reduced incidents in approach corridors, fewer illegal tows in exclusion zones, more on-time night entries without escorts. Equity partners fund hard fixes, spare part caches, rapid response vessels with crews who know the reefs by name, and dual-route logistics that avoid single points of failure. Securitize the prevention stream if you must. The coupon is paid in lower premiums and steadier output. Microstory from a quarter no, one thought remarkable makes the point. An insurer that had stepped back after 2021 asked for proof, not promises. show a 6 consecutive months with 0 dusk-hour incidents within a defined 6-kilometer band, show logged liaison calls that cleared fishing gear before convoys, show pressure trend lines from umbilicals within tolerance, show community payouts tied to those metrics posted in 2 villages. The operator delivered. The P&I Club cut deductibles. A Hull underwriter shaved the war risk add-on. 2 owners who had refused dusk entries reversed their orders. The approach lane breathed. Meanwhile, prevention is not just social. It is mechanical humility. Cash spares where monsoons will not trap them. Pre-book heavy lift windows in cyclone shoulders. Train a second team of ROV pilots so an illness ashore does not idle a campaign. Share anonymized near-miss data across operators so the same anchor scar does not blindside 2 projects in one season. None of this sells in speeches. All of it shows up as fewer red bars on schedulers' screens. Buyers see the payoff in quieter meetings. A risk officer crosses out a caveat. A procurement board drops an internal surcharge it had quietly tacked onto Mozambique deliveries. Ratepayers feel it as the absence of a spike on a cold Thursday. Politicians sense it as one less angry call about a blackout that never arrived. The distance between a co-op stipend and a city's lights is long only on a map. In math, it is a straight line. What nobody knew at the time was how quickly a few verified quarters could begin to pull the 20 trillion back inside a fence line shareholders recognize. Capital loves momentum, so does caution. The curve will not smooth itself. It needs receipts pinned to a wall where skeptics can put a finger on each one. Here is the last ledger entry. Doing nothing is not free. It is an invoice that arrives as congested detours, missed tides, and premiums that harden into culture. Paying early for prevention is not charity. It is price control by another name. Build the only wall that works, and the discount on Mozambique shrinks. Fail, and gravity writes the decade for you. The crisis clock, 24 months that decide a decade. The clock started ticking the night, a dusk approach was waved off, and a buyer 5,000 kilometers away stared at an empty hour on a grid. From that moment, the next 24 months stopped being calendar and became choreography. Project restarts, monsoon windows, election cycles, and interest rates moving like tides. Here's the cadence the basin lives by. Cyclones bracket the first quarter and the last. Between them sit narrow shoulder seasons when seas behave and heavy lifts fly. Miss a maintenance slot in April, and the next clean window might be September. Miss September, and you pay for it until the next year. Every 6-hour weather delay can push a tide. Every missed tide can push a week. Enough weeks become a lost season. Onshore, the restart window is its own metronome. Total Energy's site needs stability that holds, not just clears a patrol's report. Contractors want guarantees that outlast a press conference. Insurers want quarters, not weeks, without dusk-hour scares near approach lanes. Slide any of those, and the ramp toward 2028 through 2030 drifts right. The crane stays still. The banker's confidence does too. Elections fold into the clock like hidden currents. A regional vote shifts a commander. A national campaign shifts budgets and priorities. Deals pause while candidates promise faster roads and cleaner books. When a new minister sits, signatures lag as files get reread. Meanwhile, the sea does not pause. The monsoon arrives on time whether the paperwork does or not. Rate cycles bite in silence. If central banks stay tight, the cost of capital holds high. That turns every delay into compound pain. A project that made sense at one discount rate looks thinner at another. Tranches wait for milestones that wait for weather that waits for escorts that wait for a liaison's text from a village meeting. Each wait ticks the same clock that prices your bond. Strategic competitors do not wait. Qatar books firm volumes with start dates buyers can believe. The United States Gulf keeps layering expansions that slide ahead by months, not years. West Africa grabs swing demand when others blink. Portfolio planners redraw maps with habits, trust what shows up. Mozambique's pillar becomes a hopeful footnote unless the next 4 seasons post receipts. Here's a micro story that decides more than it seems. A restart team plans a heavy lift campaign for late May, threading between cyclone tails and election rallies. A surprise district curfew ashore clips night convoys that feed the laid-on yard. The weather holds, but the cranes sit. The window collapses into June rain. The campaign slides to October. A critical compressor install misses the freeze. Cash flow that was supposed to start in the first quarter next year now begins in the third. A buyer swaps in a Nigerian cargo for winter cover and rewrites next year's procurement rule to exclude dusk entries in northern Mozambique without pre-funded premiums. One local curfew just set a corporate policy in another hemisphere. Tipping points come quiet, then all at once. Enough missed quarters and the trusted corridor story becomes the stranded asset whisper. Insurers hold surcharges even after incidents drop, arguing culture takes longer to change than a season's stats. Traders keep Mozambique as optional, never essential. The basin's discount hardens into identity. What nobody wants to say aloud is simple. The next 2 monsoon shoulders, the next 2 election calendars, and the next 2 rate decisions will decide whether Rovuma sits on the front page of procurement decks or the appendix. Hit 4 clean windows, 2 weather, 2 politics, with proof in each, and premiums soften, schedules firm, and restarts stick. Miss them, and buyers move contracts elsewhere for a decade. This is the moment everything changes again. And it brings us back to that night in the Channel, when a convoy waited for a light that did not move, and a committee in London moved a decimal that did. If they build the only wall that works, gas flows, premiums ease, and lights far from Mozambique stay on. If they don't, a narrow sea will keep billing the world for its doubts. Want the untold map behind your energy bill? Watch our next episode on the GIUK energy trap and see how another corridor shapes your winter. Subscribe to GeoQuest so you don't miss how geography rigs markets and how small currents decide trillion-dollar outcomes.